Today I'm going to be making a Pear Gateau Breton. It's one of those cakes that is borderline a pastry. When you're putting it together, it looks like you're making pastry. You're rolling it out like pastry, putting it together in a tin like pastry. But once it bakes up, it ends up having this wonderful crumb. And this is one of those ones you can add basically any fruit you'd like. You could add apple, you could add prunes, you could add something like a berry like raspberries, and I even read of people using caramels. So a lot of things are possible on this one. Today I'll be making individual gâteaux, but you can easily make one 8-inch as well. Get an egg separated. We got about 5 egg yolks going in. Save your egg whites for things that are meringue based for later. And for this recipe, cold butter is the name of the game. Room temperature butter is all great for cakes and other things where you're creaming it, but anything pastry based, you want it cold. And I'm measuring everything on a scale for more accuracy. In goes our all-purpose flour. I find that unless I'm making bread, all-purpose always seems to make things short enough for any pastry, or cakes, or cookies. Some Bolivian rose salt in this case. Good times, just what I have on hand. Totally not an endorsement for my chocolate. Some cane sugar. With recipes like this, having a big sugar component always makes a nice caramelization in the oven. In fact, it's a great indication when you've forgotten sugar. If something turns out crazy pale, then you know it's gone wrong. At least in most cases. All right, whisking time. Breaking up those dry ingredients, trying to get it as smooth as possible. Once we add our liquid, if there's any bits that haven't been mixed in properly, they can tend to cling to the liquid and show up even after baking. There's a few opportunities in baking that allow for a meditative moment, and working pastry with your hands to get a breadcrumb texture is definitely one of them. This is one of those things you can definitely do in a food processor, but there's certainly something to be said for the visceral, slow process of working something with your hands. Once you've got your breadcrumb-like consistency, you can go ahead and add your egg yolks, your vanilla extract, and a bit of liquor. In our case, I have some brandy. This is the best way to make sure that something stays short. And by short, I mean short chains of gluten. Unlike something you'd find in a bread, longer chains, we're looking for something more akin to shortbread, something that crumbles apart and has a delicate crumb. Once you've got it shaped into a cohesive ball, go ahead and grab Tupperware, plastic bag, plastic wrap, whatever. Form it into a nice little rectangle, make it easier to roll out. And into the fridge for 30 minutes. There's something so cool about making these older rustic style bakes. I mean, these aren't the kind of things that you'll see at most bakeries, but home we can really let our imaginations run wild. All right, wedge this sucker out of the thing. Not always easy to do in one piece. I got lucky there, not too much left behind. And let's sling some flour across the surface. Just enough to make it sure it doesn't stick. This isn't a dough that tends to, but It can be frustrating, and I tend to like to err on the safe side. Today I'm using not a child's rolling pin, but a guided rolling pin. This is set at 3/8 of an inch just to make sure with these individual Gateau that they're all at the same thickness. If you're making this as one big Gateau, then it doesn't matter as much. You just separate your dough into two and roll or press it into the circle of your springform pan once you get there. This doesn't need to be pretty or anything since we're just cutting out circles. I'm just trying to get it as long as possible to maximize what's getting cut out. Just checking for sticking and unnecessary turn and find the right cutter. 3" is what I'm using for these. I'm double checking to make sure that it's the right one now, and it is. I always find something so pleasing in these moments where you have something that's kind of chaotic, very imperfect, and then you start making these little close to perfect things out of chaos, essentially. This is also one of the times having a bench scraper is super nice. If this sticks at all, having a bench scraper to lift things off, using flour as almost like ball bearings to get under things is going to save a huge headache. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, of course. But it's those little things that you can smile to yourself and look back on the times when you were doing something in essentially a backwards way until you saw the light. I can't tell you how many times I've done something for like a decade or 20 years, and all of a sudden I watch something or I have an epiphany and I realize that I've just been doing something in not the brightest way for, a good portion of my life. All right, now let's roll out the other part. Same deal. Just folded the dough over itself as gently as possible. Invariably, the second roll is always going to develop a little gluten. In a perfect world, and, a lot of bakers in the traditional pastry making just throw a lot of trim stuff away. If you're really persnickety about what you're going for, essentially that's the only way to ensure that your dough is as short as possible, or the texture, consistency that you wanted it to be, not having too much flour mixed in. There's always a reason you could make for it. And today we've got some pears coming from the Crow and Moss Gardens. These are pineapple pears I started growing about 7 years ago. Finally getting to the point where there's just way too many pears to do stuff with at home, and what a great use to bring them in and make some recipes with them at work. My freezer in the basement is already thanking me. So into each of these goes enough to where you can make a little cluster in the middle. In the full batch, you just do like one whole pear in slices. I just have chopped up bits in this case. It doesn't really matter. It's just going to make it a little more rustic, and there's going to be a little bit more spillage. We're going to whisk up an egg to do an egg wash. I'm adding just a tiny bit of salt to help break up the proteins. Just going to do a nice light coating on these. The key word is rustic, and, I'm not getting too crazy. I'm not mixing cream or milk or doing some other variation on egg yolk washes. All have different results, but sometimes it's nice to keep it simple. And commence strategic motorized push-in. Check. Okay, so we're going to take a fork and make some crisscross patterns in these. It's actually quite a bit easier to do in an 8-inch spring form, but I'm slowly getting better at doing it in the 3-inch molds. Known originally as the Lorient cake, it was introduced in 1863 at the Paris Universal Exhibition, where, surprise, surprise, it won in all of its categories. It became known as the Gateau Breton thereafter, as all the families that made them in Brittany had their own variations, and its popularity spread out from there. Once these are scored to a basic satisfaction, they can join their friends on the perforated sheet tray that I'm using today. These aren't necessary, but it just helps a little in circulation in the oven. especially with a lot of pans filling up an oven, having a little bit more air movement in between the sheet trays makes a great difference. All right, nice and golden brown. After these have cooled, they can come out of the molds, or in the single Gateau version, the 8-inch spring form. One lovely thing with bakes like this with fruit is when you get a little bit that kind of finds its way out and caramelizes on the edges. I mean, that's just kind of a gem of a flavor that you can't really replicate. Last thing to do with these, try not to eat them all in one go.